Hello and welcome to Fill in the Blanks, a podcast series by International Organization for Migration and the Climate Mobility Innovation Lab. I'm Sonali Manimaran, Climate Displacement Specialist at IOM. In this series, we'll be exploring what's driving climate mobility in Asia and the Pacific and how it's unfolding across the region. Through expert conversations, we're going to be discussing emerging solutions and initiatives and where action needs to go next. Today, we're joined by Bradley Mellicker. He heads the IOM's Climate Mobility and Innovation Lab in Asia and the Pacific, leading inclusive, evidence-based responses to climate-related mobility. He brings extensive experience across the Middle East, West Africa, Caribbean, and Southeast Asia, working on displacement, disaster risk reduction, humanitarian response, and recovery in crisis-affected settings. Welcome, Brad.
Thank you.
So, you've worked in some of the world's most complex displacement contexts: post-conflict Iraq, post-disaster recovery in Haiti and the Philippines. How have these experiences shaped your understanding of human mobility, and what has led you to focus on climate as a driver of displacement now?
I think there are a few points that are important, or important takeaways from my experiences in the countries that you've mentioned, as well as others. I think the first is really the staggering cost that displacement can have on countries, on societies, and on communities. Whether we're talking about political costs, economic costs, social costs, and above all, human costs, we see the impact that long-term displacement in particular has on societies. We see a need from the perspective of governments as well as from the perspective of the international community to support populations in need, those who have been displaced already, whether due to disasters, whether linked to climate or otherwise, as well as those who were forced to move due to conflict and complex dynamics in certain countries. In addition, though, we also understand the risk that people face of having to move in the future. So those who already move face huge challenges, vulnerabilities, require humanitarian assistance, and so on and so forth. But what we're really trying to do here, and what we see as an emerging need, especially in the context of climate change, is to work really more on prevention. And when we talk about prevention, we're talking about the who's most likely to need to move or be forced to move in the future due to climate change impacts, or other factors, and where do they live now? If we have this information, governments, international partners, and communities themselves, actions can be taken in order to increase adaptation, support resilience, and ultimately, hopefully, help people in preventing the eventual necessity of having to move in the future.
So there's this new kid on the block that you're now leading, the Climate Mobility and Innovation Lab. What's the vision behind it, and what are you really trying to address with this lab?
So I think the Climate Mobility Innovation Lab comes from requests from our member states, from governments, from countries, that in light of climate change and its increasing impacts, whether we talk about the impacts that climate change is having on the frequency and intensity of typhoons or cyclones, for example, whether we're talking about slow onset impacts such as desertification or sea level rise and so on, or the socioeconomic impacts of climate change. We see increasing demand, let's say, increasing requests from our member states to do more, to innovate, to do more with the limited resources that are available, whether we're talking about preparedness over the short term or adaptation over the longer term. So CMIL comes from those requests, from our feedback, from our member states, and is direct response to some of the challenges that countries in this region and beyond are facing. From my own experience, working in multiple displacement settings, whether disaster-related or conflict-related over time, I've seen the utility and the interest and the need for more innovative solutions. Can we do better with data? Can we do more working directly with communities, with experts, with institutions in the countries concerned? And ultimately, can we do more collectively to help people avoid this eventuality of being forced to leave their houses, for example, in the case of their homes, in the case of displacement, as well as people who choose to move, such as migration as an adaptation measure? Can we do more to support that process where this is the choice of people? So, CMIL is a new structure on the one hand, but responding to, I think, long-standing needs and requests both of governments and of what we've observed and what we know about the way that communities react to displacement situations and how they might prepare for potential displacement situations in the future.
So touching on these innovations that you mentioned, can you talk to us a little bit about some of the initiatives that the lab has rolled out in its first year so far?
Sure. So the lab, I think we have, two flagship products, let's say, or innovations that I'll talk about in a moment. But really, I think before we get there, I think it's important to say that we're really focusing on the grassroots, on the bottom up. We want to understand not only what's a priority and what's important from the perspective of governments, which is super important and necessary, but also what communities think, what they see. They are the sort of agents for change. They are the ones that will suffer the consequences of population movements, for example, in the future, and also the drivers of change, whether we're talking again about prevention or adaptation or preparedness. It's communities themselves that often need to act, to be supported, to minimize some of the impacts that we see related to climate change. So from that perspective, we're consulting regularly with communities, with civil society organizations, with universities, for example, as well as with governments. Out of that has emerged, interest in a wide variety of different types of innovations, using machine learning and artificial intelligence to increase the effectiveness of landslide early warning systems, for example. We see a lot of interest in exploring the intersection between nature-based solutions on the one hand and population movement on the other, especially in the context of climate change. But we see all of those innovations and others as building on sort of core innovations that we've been working on over the past year. And for that, we have, I think, two twin kind of flagship programs. The first is called RICD, or the Risk Index for Climate Displacement. And this is really a data tool looking at predictive analytics, machine learning, AI, but also community level insights in a way that will help us in understanding or answering some of the questions, these key questions that we keep coming up with. Who's likely to have to move in the future, and where do they live now? And also, as a related point, why may they be forced to move in the future? If we have this information at a more granular level, at a more operational level, we think that governments, as well as their partners, are in a better position to act. Whether we talk about policy development, for example, our tool can feed into government policies, national adaptation plans, and so on, but can also serve on the finance side. And for this, we've created the Climate Catalytic Fund, or CCF, which is a twin pillar designed to work in tandem with RICD, namely to support locally led adaptation through blended finance, through innovative financing strategies that we can use to support communities themselves to identify and ultimately address some of the challenges and vulnerabilities that they face. So as we head towards our symposium event going forward, we will see the results so far of the innovations that we've worked on, RICD and CCF, as we begin to roll them out now on a pilot basis, and we hope on a larger scale basis in the future.
These sound like two very complementary, but they also sound really ambitious. So what has contributed to their success so far?
An important point in this regard is that we're really trying to build on what exists already and build on what's already been done. We know that governments have been investing for years, decades in certain cases, in increasing the effectiveness of their data systems, of their prioritization as it relates to adaptation or as it relates to disaster risk reduction and so on. And equally, there are many different climate finance mechanisms, whether at the international level, such as the Green Climate Fund or the Adaptation Fund, as well as at national and sometimes even local levels. What we're trying to do here is to, first of all, build on what exists, utilize what has been learned in the past, and improve and to iterate on that. So as it relates to RICD, we're really trying to get to granular levels of data, operational data that can be used directly to underpin the activities that we will finance through CCF. And at the same time, CCF is a tool that's designed to fill a niche, essentially to support locally led adaptation. We're looking at this again from a bottom-up perspective, grounded in data with RICD, but in a way that will support local communities in identifying and again utilizing their own capacities, creativity, energy, and ultimately resources in addressing. So yes, they're ambitious on the one hand, and we're in pilot stage now. We're about 1 year into this, and we're seeing, I think, quite good results, quite positive feedback from governments, communities, universities, and so on. But we also, I think, are driven by the fact that these tools fill a need, a recognized need that has been expressed to us by governments, by communities, and by other partners. I want to mention just one more point on that question. We're doing this a little bit differently. We've pioneered, or I think, tried to adopt a new way of working, wherein we want to work with institutions that are the most directly impacted by climate change impacts, for example, and are likely to be among the actors that will support solutions. So in that sense, we've created a sort of co-creation mechanism or a network in which we bring together or convene experts from different universities, from governments, from other institutions from all around Asia and the Pacific to come together to co-design and co-implement together these tools, both on the data side and on the finance side.
So looking ahead 5 to 10 years, where do you see the lab going, and how do you see it growing beyond what it is right now?
I mean, there's an adage, I suppose, in the international development sector, the humanitarian sector, that if we're successful, we won't have a job, right? So ideally, in 5 to 10 years, none of this will be needed. However, in case that it is needed, and we suspect that it may be, additional investment, additional resource, additional attention as it relates to climate change adaptation, we hope that RICT becomes a tool that evolves alongside the emerging needs and changing needs of governments as well as communities. So we've structured this tool currently as I mentioned, as a way to address gaps in data, for example, or as a way to address gaps in climate finance. But this will evolve, right? And maybe we start to look at, more advanced predictive analytics and artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies on the one hand. Maybe we change the way, or we utilize technologies to better understand how communities themselves think and react and perceive the risks and challenges that they face. So, I mean, assuming products like these are still needed in the future, we would hope that we'd be able to continue partnering with governments, but also other segments of societies to expand these tools in ways that are most useful to them.
As much as we all hope that, we do not need to be doing this work in some time because we've effectively managed these risks, certainly it's probably going to be continued for quite some more time. Sometimes it's slow, sometimes it's frustrating, but what gives you hope in doing work on climate displacement?
To be perfectly honest, I mean, we see challenges, right? We see challenges related to adaptation finance. I think the most recent statistic that I've seen, at least, is a $300 billion annual gap in climate change adaptation finance globally, which is insurmountable. It's a massive amount of money, right? We see maybe progress towards that through some of the negotiations at COP, through the establishment of the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, and through other mechanisms. But on the one hand, we see the challenges as quite substantial, right? Increasing emissions from greenhouse gases with limited progress in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, these challenges related to access to finance, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, I would say what gives me hope and optimism are two things. One, most importantly, I think is the energy, motivation, creativity, ideas, and capacity of people. Right? People in the communities that are most impacted by some of these challenges, but also others. When we talk to them, when we work with them, when we engage with them, etc., we understand that, yes, these challenges are complex. Yes, these challenges are new in certain cases, but that with technical capacity, with financial support, with the engagement of the communities themselves, that we can do more and maybe even get to a point where we can overcome some of these challenges. And I think the second big area of optimism, let's say, is around the emergence of new technologies, whether we're talking about technology related to data. Again, I mentioned artificial intelligence, machine learning, predictive analytics, and so on and so forth, but also in the realm of climate change mitigation, right? We talk about the precipitous drop in the price of photovoltaic cells, for example, also the proliferation of battery technology, etc. We see, I think, ways in which there might be opportunity to meaningfully reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to move towards a green transition, which, of course, hopefully minimize the need for climate change adaptation in the future. So I would say, the energy and motivation of communities, and at the same time, the proliferation of new technologies that can be used both on the mitigation side and on the adaptation side.
Brilliant. So from you today, Brad, we heard a lot about how this is a really urgent problem emerging in Asia and Pacific on climate displacement, and how there's a call from governments and communities to do something about this, and the Climate Mobility and Innovation Lab is doing proactive, innovative work on this through the Risk Index for Climate Displacement and the Climate Catalytic Fund. So stay tuned for updates on these two projects and more, and join us in the next episode where we will continue discussions with partners of the Climate Mobility and Innovation Lab on this very pressing issue.